Now, Cindy, you've written in this week's magazine about friends like Xi's. President Xi is currently in Europe and he's touring 3 different countries, France, Serbia and Hungary. Tell us what these countries have in common and why he's chosen to go there.
Yeah, they're not the most kind of obvious countries you might think. Yeah, especially when he hasn't been to Europe in 5 years. So this is, a rare trip. But I think they are amongst the most sino-sympathetic on the continent. So I use sino-sympathetic rather than sino-philic because France is actually in a very complicated place with China at the moment. China is flooding the European market with cheaper electric vehicles and solar panels, which is not good for French manufacturers. So there's a bit of a trading spat going on there, but both leaders want to have a better relationship. Serbia and Hungary, on the other hand, which is what I focus most on in my piece, are just some of China's biggest cheerleaders, not just in Europe, but in the world. And these are not countries that we often think about in the Anglosphere, but China has been trying to charm them for years now.
Katja, let's bring in the German dimension to all of this as well, because obviously Germany and France are 2 big continental powers. Talk us through what's happening with Germany's relationship with China in recent years and Scholz's engagement with Xi as well.
Yeah, it's incredibly complex as well because China is still Germany's largest trading partner, but on the flip side, you do now also have these economic and political conflicts. So, in a way, they're trying to move away from China. There's public support for that as well. So when you look at surveys, the German public are increasingly sort of wary and kind of not outright hostile towards China, but certainly suspicious as far as kind of Germany's entanglement with them are concerned. So they're trying to move away. But equally, industry is sort of sitting there and saying, well, hang on a minute, we're completely, entangled with them and you can't just do that from one year to another, kind of, indicating that we're always going to have this relationship and then you're moving away from them, which is making supply lines, imports, exports, everything a lot more complicated for German industry. So Scholz is trying to navigate those difficult waters by kind of signaling that they're moving away from China without doing it so quickly as to a kind of wrecking German industry by doing so.
Katja there talks about countries moving away from China, and in your piece you talk about how this was initially a much more pan-European approach, but that some countries have moved away in recent years for various events. Can you tell us why these countries have chosen to stick with China rather than others who are moving away, for instance?
Yeah, it's a great question, James. I think for those who have moved away, a few things have made them move away that hasn't applied to Serbia and Hungary. So for one, in terms of investment, actually China promised in 2012 to have massive inflow of investment to Central and Eastern European countries. It created this alliance called the 16+1, which is 16 European countries with one China. But actually by 2020, most of those countries had seen very little Chinese investment. So they just thought, this is not really worth it. Then the pandemic hit, and obviously that really destroyed China's public reputation in a lot of people's opinions. And then came the Russian invasion of Ukraine, actually. And for a lot of countries that have a memory of communism, a memory of Soviet supremacy, that really sat very uncomfortably with them that China would not condemn Putin for the invasion itself. So Poland and the Czech Republic, for example, are still in a 16+1, but have become some of China's fiercest critics. Now for Serbia and Hungary, that lack of antagonism towards Russia is not a problem because they are Russo-aligned themselves. So that's not a problem. China's also the single largest investor in both of those countries as well. And in my piece, I detail the billions of dollars and euros that have gone into infrastructure projects in these countries. And this week we've heard about more as well. So for them, ideologically, they're relatively aligned. Economically, it makes sense.
And Katja, where does Russia come into all of this? Cindy there talks about different attitudes, but I wonder, how does Russia feel perhaps about having this kind of Chinese influence in an area where perhaps they might regard it as their traditional sphere of influence?
Yeah, Russia's and China's history has always been incredibly complex. So even when they were more sort of ideologically aligned, if you will, so when they were both sort of communist superpowers, that relationship was more hostile most of the time than actually aligned in that respect. So, there's always been a bit of a kind of, especially when it comes to Europe, a bit of a rivalry going on. But it's interesting that, so I am in Budapest at the moment, and she's apparently staying in a hotel just about 100 meters away from where I am. So, he's brought his own sort of cheerleading committee, flags everywhere. So it's interesting that the red carpet is sort of rolled out for him. And I think for places like Hungary, to look at Russia and China, they're both kind of bargaining. They both sort of bring bargaining mass with them when you're Hungary and you're kind of dealing with both of them. You can kind of play that out against each other, basically, and against Europe as well, and use that tension that exists, basically, to try and position yourself in what Orban would probably argue is quite an independent position as a result of that. So I think that's where that sort of tension between Russia and China comes in for countries like Hungary, who are trying to exploit that for themselves, I think.
Cindy, you write in your piece about the sort of Chinese playbook in these areas, which is partly about investment, but also about acknowledging and sympathising with historic grievances. For instance, you mentioned an event 25 years ago when the Chinese embassy, I believe, was attacked during the Serbian war that went on by a NATO missile. So hence the kind of shared anti-NATO element there with Serbia and China. But I just wondered, for instance, how much does the playbook sort of differ in Europe as it does from elsewhere across the world? We've talked a lot about, on this podcast before, about Belt and Road Initiative, for instance. Is this very much different in Europe, or is it the same playbook everywhere?
Yeah, I think it is the same playbook. So fundamentally, what underlies it all is massive investment. These relatively less wealthy countries look at China's economic success in recent years and think, I want a slice of that, or I want to learn how they do it. And that's a very persuasive message to developing countries all over the world. And then China backs it up by whether it's state-owned businesses or private companies going to build infrastructure. And because of China's size of its industry, in recent years, that has been relatively successful. The other part of the playbook, the icing on top, if you will, is this kind of historical narrative, is this narrative of victimhood. So you mentioned in Serbia, this is an episode that we actually, in the West, we don't think about very often, but it really kind of struck at China's psyche, this psyche of national humiliation, that the Americans could just come and bomb your embassy. And now the Americans say it was an accident, but the Chinese have never believed it, and 3 Chinese nationals were killed. So I just think it's such an interesting notion of two ways of looking at the world. And when it comes to the Serbian link, just see this week was talking about this bond forged with the blood of our compatriots. It's very visceral stuff. And they still remember. Now, when you go to other parts of the world, for example, in Africa, what the Chinese like to go back to is the Ming dynasty, where a Chinese explorer called Zheng He first went and discovered Africa, as it were, and did trading in the 1400s. And so they bring up all of that kind of historical stuff, or they talk about the Bandung Conference in the last century, when these kind of non-aligned African countries were also, non-aligned with Mao's China. All of these things, they basically go back through the history textbook and say, what can we, Control F, what can we find about this particular country? And let's hand that up, because America is not your friend, we are.
I just wonder, for instance, Katja, you're in the Balkans right now. What do you think attitudes are like in terms of empathising with that Chinese narrative right there about grievance across Europe? We've talked specifically about Serbia and Hungary, but where else do you think in Europe is there kind of more likely to find Chinese allies in these different areas?
Well, it's difficult for China at the moment because the EU has sort of moved into quite a more combative stance than it did in the past, and so smaller countries that are in the EU have kind of got to decide, how far can you push your pro-China stance without alienating other powerful countries within the EU too much. So it puts them between those two stores, if you will. And that in turn, it's sort of helped, I think, that Germany's become a little bit more skeptical. And from that angle, I think they can go a little bit further than they did in the past. But when you're thinking about infrastructure and other kind of economic influence of China in Europe, the EU is currently thinking about, for instance, doing something about the flooding of the market with electric vehicles, as we've just heard. So those kinds of things all play into it, and the smaller countries certainly have got to be very careful where they place themselves in that conflict. For countries like Hungary, I think it works because it's quite. It's got into this mind frame where it's kind of the outlier anyway, putting brakes on certain European policies and always being quite combative because it's got away with it in the past so often that I don't think it's particularly afraid of sort of cozying up with China and Russia in the way that maybe other countries would be, where the EU has got bigger levers to pull, if you will.
I'm always interested, Cindy, in terms of how these relationships with China work, because, through a bilateral relationship, it might be quite good. Serbia, for instance, talking about its history with China, for instance. But are these countries not, for instance, worried by things like, as we saw this week, reports that China might have been involved in the Ministry of Defence hacking, or seen for instance, how China's handled issues like the Hong Kong crackdown, for instance? Is there no kind of sense of concern about what might happen there, or is it purely about self-interest and what the kind of relationship is like between those two states on a bilateral one-to-one level? I
think some of those concerns do matter for some of China's allies, and that's why they've got further. So Lithuania, for example, was a part of the 16+1, but has now become one of China's fiercest critics in Europe. And establish relations with Taiwan, because I think these kind of ideological or principled reasons have kind of come out on top. Doesn't seem to bother Serbia and Hungary just yet, but it is interesting to note that polls have shown that in Hungary, and Katja can perhaps speak to this, in Hungary, opposition MPs, the media and public opinion generally tend to be more negative towards China than Orban's party is. So I think these things are always in flux.
Yeah. Katja, what is the reaction in Budapest to Xi's visit there?
It seems to be quite mixed from what I can gather. I mean, I'm only a sort of visitor here, and from that angle, it's always going to be an outsider's perspective. But journalists have said exactly that. So that there's a mixed kind of response, because some people feel, there's this cozying up is sort of undignified, and what's the point when Hungary is trying to get more independent, kind of rolling out the red carpet to another superpower, as it were. Other people do see it as a means of suspending Hungary between these big power blocks. So, it's a country that is permanently out to try and be independent because of its history. I think there's a hypersensitivity towards being controlled by others. And so some people see this relationship to China, as a means of sort of putting Hungary in between all of the big power blocks in the world. So sitting somewhere between Russia, China, the EU and America, and thereby retaining its independence as far as is possible for a comparatively small country in Europe. So that mixed response you get from people here as well, be that ordinary people, taxi drivers sort of grumbling about it, for example, and saying, it's all a big disruption for nothing. And journalists sort of sitting in between their camps, depending on whether they're aligned with Orban or not.
And James, if I can come back on your point about, the MOD hack, for example, it depends on where in the world you align your kind of military defense ideas. So for a country like Serbia, NATO is the enemy.
Yeah.
When we talk about China's antagonism against NATO or against Britain, well, Serbia is quite okay with that because of that history in the Kosovo War that we've already talked about in the 90s. So again, there's different ways of seeing who is in your group and who is outside of your group. And I think even just on the doorsteps of Europe, there are people who think differently.